Okay, so yeah, the last week on air sound. Hopefully, it will tie stuff together. It won't tie everything together, but I think most of the things in the last few weeks are going to be relevant to really having a good understanding of what air sound is and how it works. And if there are any questions still, then certainly post them in Slack, and I'll get around to answering them. So slide 2, what we're going to cover today, I'm going to talk a bit about what is wrong with stereo. I know I mentioned a bit about that last week. But I just want to go over some of the key points. Why we want air sound. It will certainly follow on from the problems with stereo. How air sound works, and then I'm going to talk about how air sound sounds. Okay, so slide 3. Stereo. So as we said before, stereo requires two sources of sound, and each of those sources can comprise one or more drivers. So you could have a tweeter and a mid-range from the left channel, a tweeter and a mid-range from the right channel. Both of them will each form a single channel in that two-channel stereo. You need at least two channels of audio, two independent channels. If you're listening to the radio and there's just a guy speaking, then most of what you're listening to will be mono, but you're still going to get two channels off that. All that means is that most of the audio is shared across the two channels equally. As I mentioned again last week, stereo requires, it might have been the week before that, but stereo requires sweet spot positioning for the listener, and that's because it relies on the listener being in the right position so that it can create what are called phantom images between the two speakers. Now, in that sweet spot, even when you have got a listener in the right position, centrally placed images are going to be muffled, and there's going to be some coloration there because of the interference between the ears and having two sources of sound. Outside of that sweet spot, you get the Haas effect, which is where as soon as you move slightly off to the left or off to the right, the sound will collapse into the nearest speaker, whichever side you move to. So they're the main problems with stereo. In what forms does stereo come? Well, the ideal form, and as I drew in week 2, you need two separate loudspeakers spaced 30 degrees off a center line, so 60 degrees apart in relation to the listener's position. I guess you're not going to encounter that form of it that often in stores. You're going to encounter it more as in portable speaker form, in which case you're going to get two sets of drivers, the left and right sets of drivers spaced as little as 10 centimeters apart or less, as in the Bose SoundLink. That's still a stereo speaker, but the speakers are spaced as around 10 centimeters apart. And the other form that you're going to encounter stereo in is soundbar form, in which case it's going to be the same as the Bose SoundLink. It's going to be slightly bigger, and you're going to get the two sets of drivers spaced more like 35, 40 centimeters apart, something like that. Depends on the size of the soundbar. So on slide 5, I've got the pictures of what the implementation of stereo might look like. On the left-hand side, you've got what the portable implementation might look like, and there you can see something like a Bose SoundLink, forward-facing speakers, and the listener sat back. There is absolutely no opportunity for the listener there to get any interaural level differences or interaural time differences for sounds coming from each of the two speakers. And because of that, there's going to be no opportunity for stereo there. If we move to the right, you can see the ideal form of stereo, which is with the speakers spaced at 30 degrees off the center line each. And then there's the soundbar implementation in the middle, which is, again, similar to the portable speaker setup, but it's just slightly bigger. So, slide 6. Clearly, the portable speaker is the worst application for stereo of all. It's bad because there's still interference between the drivers because they're still spaced somewhat apart, and they're still reproducing the same sounds. And there's absolutely no stereo imaging because the speakers are too close together. Now, the only good thing about a portable speaker implementation of stereo is that there's a relatively consistent lack of stereo. So I think, even the good point is kind of a bad point. It's just consistently bad. So the reason why I say that is because as you move around this portable speaker, you may get a drop off in high frequencies. Again, as we said in week 1, as you move off center from a speaker, the high frequencies will start to fall away because high frequencies tend to beam straight ahead, whereas low frequencies will radiate omnidirectionally. So as you move off center from, say, a Bose SoundLink, it'll start to sound more and more muffled. I think personally sounds quite muffled anyway, but it will still sound more muffled as you move off center. But at least it will still sound like it's coming from one place. It won't collapse into a near speaker or anything like that. So it is, in that sense, consistently poor. At least it's consistent. With the soundbar case, it's similar to the portable system, except you do get some kind of image. There is some distance between the left and right speakers. So, as you're sat back watching your TV and you've got your soundbar, stereo soundbar there, you can kind of tell that some sounds are coming from the left, some sounds are coming from the right, if you're sat in the sweet spot again. So there is still a sweet spot, and that's why I've said here, similar to the portable system. It shares the same problems as the portable system, except you get slightly wider image. And there's still more chance of the image collapsing now. So that consistency that you get with a portable speaker has gone now, in that if you do sit off to one side, or if you've got friends around, some of them will experience the stereo soundbar as if the sound is all coming from one side of the soundbar. And of course you get the interference just as much as you would with any stereo system. So they're the three most common, I would say, implementations of stereo, and so it gives you a feel for what you might encounter and the problems associated with them. Moving on to slide 8, why air sound? Well, it should be clear that there's a lot of issues with stereo, and a lot of those issues are shared by surround sound systems as well. So it's not like we're just there to replace stereo. Stereo is the main one, but all of the issues that are issues with stereo. I've talked about Dolby Atmos in week 2 and how that relies again on phantom imaging. There's still interference and sound still collapses and so on. So we've got all the same issues. So I've got a list here of what the ideal system would be. So there's clearly a requirement for a sound system which has no sweet spot, so you can have friends around, they can all experience the same thing. A system which has stable imaging in the same way relating to the sweet spot, in that you experience the same sound image wherever you're sat. Is a single box solution. It doesn't require lots of speakers placed all around the room, and a system which is not based on phantom images. And the problem with phantom images, as I said, is that they're not real, so you get interference. They're not well reproduced sound images. So that's kind of the motivations for it. On slide 9, there's a very simplistic diagram for how we form air sound, and it's quite simple really anyway. You've got a left and a right signal from your stereo, the stereo information coming in, and we basically split this into two separate signals. The first signal is simply left plus right, and this is actually your mono sound. This is what you listen to when you listen to a mono conversion of a stereo signal. And it's also what is played through the center channel in a surround system. And the other split that we take off the 2-channel feed, we subtract from each other, so we get what's known as a difference or a side channel. Now, it's worth mentioning that in this process, it's a very simple arithmetic process. There is no information lost, and there is no information created. And the problems with some virtual surround systems nowadays, I think this is an issue with, say, like Yamaha, for instance, is they manipulate sound to such an extent that you're no longer listening to just what was originally in the audio. You're listening to delayed versions of what was in the audio. You're listening to EQ'd and, as I said, manipulated versions of what was in the audio. So it becomes it becomes difficult to argue that the soundbar is reproducing faithfully anymore. But this isn't the case with air sound. Air sound is quite a relatively straightforward arithmetic process. And as such, there's no information lost, no information created. The soundbar is faithfully reproducing the original sound. And I think there's a point worth making. Slide 10 might look worse than it is. It's actually not. I'll just take you through it. So how does it work again? We've got left plus right, and that is your middle channel. So left plus right, that mono signal is what's coming through the center of your soundbar. And then we've got left minus right from the left-hand side of your soundbar, and right minus left from the right-hand side of your soundbar. So those two side channels are the same thing, but they're just flipped the other way around. So one's left minus right, one is right minus left, and they come from each side of your soundbar. Now, that's a kind of arithmetic sum acoustically, right? Because you've got all this sound coming out, and when it arrives at your ears, it's obviously going to be a combination of all of those things. So it might be interesting to look at what the arithmetic sum is of left plus right plus left minus right plus right minus left. And if you just remove the black brackets and you collect all of the lefts together, you get left plus left minus left, and you get right plus right minus right. And the result of that is those two L's cancel and the two R's cancel, and you're left with left plus right. So again, coming back to the fact that no sound is created or manipulated or whatever it is, you come back to the original left plus right channel at your ears. So what does this mean? As I mentioned, left plus right is the mono image, and it's the most important element to get right and to reproduce well. So this is, if you're listening to music, it will be the sung voice, the person who's singing. If you're listening to a film, it'll be all the key dialogue elements. If you're listening to the news, again, the dialogue. And it's reproduced in air sound systems with a dedicated channel, a dedicated speaker, a set of drivers, for instance. So in the A70, it's two 2-inch drivers and one tweeter. In the A60, it's two 2-inch drivers. And as such, there is no interference from multiple spaced sets of speakers. And as such, there's no sweet spot dependency there. You can listen to that wherever you are in the room, and it'll still be clear. It won't be interfered with because there's only one source reproducing it. Now, when it comes to the left minus right and right minus left channels, these are obviously reproduced by the side drivers. Left minus right out of the left, right minus left out of the right. And this is all the difference information. So this is all the information that isn't shared between the two channels. So if you're listening to a radio broadcast and there's a presenter's voice and it's coming through in the center and it's shared between both of those channels equally, then once you perform that left minus right arithmetic on the signal, you'll lose the presenter's voice. It'll disappear. That presenter's voice is solely containing the left plus right information, the mono image. So once you've done that difference arithmetic, his voice won't be there. It's everything else that isn't shared between the channels that's left. And that's why it's also known as the difference information as well as the side information. And this contains all the spatial imaging stuff. So the reason why I know that a sound source is supposed to be coming from the left when I listen to a stereo system is because there's nothing shared in the right. If it was, it would be a phantom image in the middle. So again, once we do this arithmetic, if there's a sound source panned off to the left that should be coming from the left-hand side, then our air sound arithmetic takes that into account. Now when we subtract left from right, we just get left because there wasn't a right in the first place. So this is why this arithmetic kind of takes care of things like that. Now, because it's the difference information, because it's all the spatial information, it actually sounds quite weird on its own. It's got nothing to kind of tie it down. It can sound normal if there is an image hard panned to the left, but most of the time it will sound a bit strange. It's a bit like going into a church, shouting really loud and then listening for the echo. That echo is the kind of thing that will be reproduced by the side channel. So that's that slide. I think that describes what left and right, left plus right and left minus right kind of are. Moving on to slide 12, how does air sound? Well, you get a stable center image wherever you are in the room. As I said before, it doesn't matter where you are in relation to the speaker, it will still sound like there's a clear, dedicated speaker, which there is, reproducing that central image. And that image is clear and without interference. The spatial imaging, as I said, is recreated by the side speakers, and this spatial imaging comprises any hard panned stuff, so any stuff that's panned either fully to the left or fully to the right, and it also contains all the ambience, envelopment, and general stereo imaging stuff. We've done tests at the university, and we've asked them to rate stereo systems versus air sound systems with general terms used to describe experiences of spatial information. So again, ambience, envelopment, immersion, and then the air sound system has always come out on top of the stereo system for those points. And that's even comparing it actually for a centrally placed listener as well. So even when you are sat in the sweet spot, our air sound system achieves greater degrees of ambience, development, and immersion than stereo systems do. And this is, again, the ideal stereo system. This isn't a stereo soundbar we're comparing it against. We're comparing an air sound soundbar against studio monitor grade Genelec stereo system placed 30 degrees off the center line. So yeah, you'd think that it's a good. If stereo was going to win, it should win in this environment. So to move on, there's no sweet spot, as I mentioned, for central images or the spatial experience. So it's not just as you move around, the spatial image stays the same, or the center image stays the same. Both stay the same as you move around. And the next point, good all-around dispersion. So this comes back to, again, a point that I made in week 1 and that I made earlier today, which is that high frequencies tend to beam straight ahead. And this is to do with the way sound interacts when it radiates from a driver. But low frequencies radiate omnidirectionally. So, as I mentioned, as you start to move off center, you tend to lose high frequencies. Now, you will lose a bit of high frequency when you move off center from an orbit sound soundbar, but only in regards to the center image. But the overall experience will actually be very well balanced because we've got these speakers facing sideways. They're reproducing high frequencies as well. So the other great thing is that not only is there is there no necessity for a sweet spot when it comes to the experience of the imaging, the experience of a stable center image, but there's also no sweet spot in regards to getting a good balanced sound all the way around, because as we move off center, we start to get more high frequencies from the side drivers. So it's kind of a triple threat in that regard. Last point here, you can hear MP3 artifacts from side channels, and this is why I said in was it week 2, I think, when I talked about MP3, that you should listen to the best quality MP3 or lossless codecs when you're listening to an Orbit Sound soundbar, and this isn't a defect in the Air Sound soundbars. This is purely the fact that you can hear the quality of sound that you're listening to more easily, and you can experience it more fully with an Air Sound soundbar. The reason why I mention this here is because when an MP3 codes the audio, it decides what's important and what's not important to the listener. And clearly the most important thing is to have a very well reproduced mono image, because most of the time what's panned centrally is the key thing. So, like I said, the dialogue or the singer's voice. Now MP3 decides that all the spatial information, which is like, the stuff that, is this speaker in a church? Is he in a small room? All that stuff that lets us understand the space in which the person who is speaking is in. The MP3 decides, well, that's not quite so important, so we'll start to degrade that. We'll start to remove information from that audio file, and the result is that you get to the point where you can really start hearing problems in the MP3, and that is what we associate with poor MP3 quality. Well, all that sound is going to be chucked out the side channel in an Air Sound system. So if you're going to listen to bad MP3s, you're going to hear the problems coming out of the side channel. So that's why that is. Final slide now. Other benefits to Air Sound that I can think of. First one is single box solution. Of course we've got a subwoofer as well, but that's just dealing with the low frequencies. So far as the high frequencies are concerned and mid-range and the spatial side of things, then it's a single box solution. You don't need multiple speakers all over the room in order to provide good imaging, good envelopment, good immersion. It's an easy setup for related reasons. You just plug and play. It's social because people can sit anywhere and enjoy the same sound. You only have one source per channel, so you've got one source feeding all your middle and your sum information, one source feeding your side 1 and one source feeding your side 2. So interference from things like room reflections and also from inter-speaker interference is kept to a minimum. And the result is that you don't need to go bananas on room treatment as well. I think a lot of people, a lot of average consumers, I say average, maybe not average, a lot of sort of hi-fi consumers do talk a lot about room treatment and the need to make sure their sound is as good as possible by using absorbers on the wall, bass traps in the corner, and so on and so on. It becomes very expensive and very clumsy. You don't need to do that with Air Sound anywhere near to the same extent. I would say you don't need to do it at all, but you might get some people that still argue that you do. And there's always a point where they say, well, I need to control my room. And you can control your room and you can decide what you want to do with your room. But at the end of the day, compared to a stereo system, an Air Sound system works with the room that it's in. It doesn't work against it. And the reason for that is because we haven't got multiple sources all facing in the same direction trying to reproduce the same sound. and it's also because the sound that benefits from being cleanly reproduced without interference is the mono channel in the middle, and that's facing you. There's only one of them, and it's coming straight at you, or it's always in the same place in regards to a listener. It's not a result of a phantom image that's set up from multiple sound sources. When it comes to the side drivers, they're facing out sideways anyway, so they again need to be reflected in order to arrive at the listener. So again, they benefit from those room reflections anyway. I would also say it's cost effective, and I've put this in here when I compare it against say a surround system, which has obviously got at least, well, for a 5.1 system, at least 6, maybe 7 speakers. So that concludes, I think, everything that I wanted to say about air sound. It's a fairly broad overview, I think, but to be honest, there's nothing particularly difficult, I would say, to understand about air sound. It's a very different way of reproducing sound. There's also that description on the website. I think there's 3 descriptions. I think it's beginners, intermediate, and advanced description of air sound on the website as well. So if you want an alternative kind of explanation, then check that out. But otherwise, as always, post your questions on Slack and I'll get around to answering them.